Welcome to the Pre-Approved Podcast. I'm here with Darson. Darson, how you doing, man?
Very good. Thank you.
All right. Well, so I thought the best way to start with this is to do a little bit of introduction and telling your story, either from a personal, you can get into some family, but really, the W-2 side, siding into like a side hustle to now going into the full entrepreneurship. Do you mind, doing a couple minute recap on kind of Darson's story?
You bet. The couple minute recap would be I've always had an entrepreneurial part of my soul. It's always been in me, but I've always had the W-2 job that paid all of the bills and never really jumped. Had a good paying W-2 job for 10, 12 years and was let go from a couple of those. And this last March, I realized that, let's try the entrepreneurial game. So I was in a HR benefits W-2 type job, and alongside of that, investing in rental properties. Started doing that simply because we didn't love the idea of putting money in the stock market. Felt like it was uncontrolled risk, and felt like the cash flowing rental properties was more reasonable for what risk level we wanted to take. And so did that. And then again, like I said, lost my W-2 job in March of 2020, and kind of decided, I don't have to, because we live on a pretty frugal, pretty low income per month lifestyle. I said, I don't have to sell that many houses as a realtor to pay those bills. And then anything on top of that is gravy. And it's gone. I would say it's the real estate market. Anyone that's been paying attention the last couple of years, it's doing very well. So it's going well.
Yeah, and I think that it's either the market's doing pretty well, but even just as we'll get into it a little bit with your story on probably the things that you've done to maybe stay within your circle of control on things that you can control and how you're helping investors in the Des Moines area and different places. So that's pretty cool. So the March 2020, that'll ring forever for anyone that's gone through with it. Was that specifically related to COVID, or was it just happenstance?
It was, I knew it was coming. I got new management. I knew at some point something was going to change, whether my job was going to change or I was no longer going to have a job. It was probably December, January of that prior year. I told my wife, I was like, hey, something's going to happen at work. It's not going real well. We're disagreeing on some things. So I don't know what that means, but we weren't living extravagant before, but we're not going to live extravagant. And we came from the Dave Ramsey pay off debt plan. So we had no debt, had emergency fund. We're saving a great dollar amount into some type of investment. So it was good. It was meant to happen.
Wonderful. And what we'll get into, I'm hoping to share is like just the smile on your face that people could see, like, hey, this could have been the greatest thing that ever happened. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but just knowing you personally, Darson, a little bit, it's like, man, you're killing things. And so fast forward then about what, 6 or 7 months. Tell me about this property that you're like, hey, I was thinking about living in this, thinking about investing in it. Or can you share a little bit on that story of like, hey, you found yourself in a unique situation?
Yeah, you bet. So as a realtor, you get to see everything on the MLS, and property. You set filters that just meet certain criteria, and this was a filter that said property over 1,000 square foot that had 2 bedrooms, and yeah, thousand over 1,000 and 2 bedrooms. And so it hit my filter, and it was a nice brick house. And in this part of town, it was cookie cutter in the 1950s. There was probably 20 of them. And I saw the house, and I said to myself, like, that's not a 2 bedroom house. That's 4 bedrooms and 3 bath. Every one of them are 1,400 square feet. And this one in particular was had a walkout basement, which is very appealing to a lot of homeowners. So looked into it further, walked it. It was an estate. So family died, or parents died, kids had it. And I walked it, and it was very outdated, but all the major things, the roof, the mechanicals, it was brick, so it didn't have anything there. All the major capital expenditures were taken care of. It was priced pretty high for that price, or for that being so dated. So I just told the realtor, hey, Mike, I'd love to move my family in here, but I can't pay this. It was listed at 230. I'll give you 185. And they said, no, that's too low. And I said, okay, whenever you want to take 185, let me know. And so this is a strategy I use as a realtor with a lot of my clients is, hey, know your price and just tell them this is the price. Whenever you want to come back to it, come back to it. So basically followed up every 2 or 3 weeks with the realtor and said, hey, any chance they want to take that? And it was no, 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 until 60 days. They said, okay, they don't want to take this house in the winter. We're going to drop it to 200,000 tomorrow. If you say yes at 185, we're good with it. And I was like, okay. And so got through, and I had a pretty solid offer. I waived inspections because I was pretty confident in that. Ended up getting a little bit more discount because the electrical box needed replaced. So I think I got it for 179. And so anyway, long story, bank said, yeah, we're good with that. Even though you have realtor income, and we understand that it's volatile, we'll give you a high interest rate with 7 or 8% interest rate. And I was comfortable with that, just given the scenario. And then was it 2 weeks before closing? They're like, yeah, we didn't realize that your income's so volatile. And I was like, that's being a realtor. Like, I make 15 grand one month and 2 the next month. It's part of it. And so they said, no, we're not going to loan on this. And at that point, I was like, okay, I could drop this deal, but I knew that house fixed up was around 250, and it didn't took $20,000 to $40,000 to fix it up. So the numbers there as a flip were there. And so I was like, okay, what are my options? And I obviously know you, Adam, and SetYourRent. And I said, SetYourRent deals with this issue. Like, this is literally what they're for. It's how they work. So I said, hey, Adam, this is a scenario. Can we make this work? And so it was a week. I think it was a week and a half, 2 weeks that we were able to determine a pretty good sizable chunk down payment, which I was going to do to the bank anyway. I mean, I was scheduled to send it to them anyway. And yeah, let's see what else happened there.
And remind me, on the bank, was this like an institutional, like a Bank of America, or was this like a local like a community bank?
Yeah, it was a local bank, because I knew that I was unbankable for the grand scheme of things. I knew the normal bank wouldn't pick me up. So I reached out to the most lenient bank in the area that typically says yes to almost anything.
So how did you find that? So that's a pretty cool distinction that the podcast listeners could link of, because if you go to a Wells Fargo or Bank of America, why in your situation, Darson, did you know right away that, like, hey, I'm not going to get a Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac loan?
I've been just being in the real estate world long enough. You understand what banks will say yes to and what they won't say yes to. And being an entrepreneur, for at least the first 2 years, they're really, really, really hesitant to give you a conventional, traditional loan, the Fannie, Freddie Mac, where the bank is just the broker. They're getting you the loan, and then 3 months later, they're selling it off. So in order to sell it off, they have to make sure that loan underwrites and fits in this perfect box. And I didn't fit into that perfect box, because although I had a really good W-2 paying job prior to, when I became a realtor, there was a couple months there I had no income as I was getting ramped up. Even though when I was closing, I had, I was making more than I had made as a W-2 employee.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where this bank is typically fits the model. They still, at this point where I've been doing it for 6 months of consistent sales income, I think they probably would have said yes to it. But because it was 3 months of pretty much no income, that was their reasoning. And they don't, that's the thing when you work with the bank, they don't have to prove why not. They just have to say, nope, sorry, like there isn't anything, it's not happening. So.
And so on one of our episodes, we were kind of highlighting the difference between a national and a local community bank or a regional bank, how it's more of a relationship based. But even, like you said, on both sides, sometimes the national will be like, yep, you're good to go. And then like 2 weeks before, they're like, oh, the underwriter or whatever, they always blame it on someone, like, oh, sorry, you can't go. And then people are like, well, what do you mean? Like, I'm 2 weeks away. Like, you gave me this pre-approval letter. And so the fact that it can happen, regionally too, it like it is rare, but it is just like, the business banker that you're working with or whoever the loan officer is like, oh yeah, just from a high level, it looks at it. But then when they go through all the nuts and bolts, sometimes there's just different boxes that they got to check, or the vice president or somebody just happens to look through this and be like, you know what, I don't think this one works. And like you said, they might just give you a generic denial letter of like, oh, not sufficient, information or something like that. And then it's like, oh, okay, I guess you don't really have much of a recourse there.
Yeah, I mean, the recourse is, I mean, that's what you get when you put your eggs in the basket of someone else's decision, right? Like, it's the reason I don't love investing in the stock market, because I don't have a decision. I don't have a choice of how that stock goes. A CEO could do something stupid and I could lose money, even if you invest in the broad general index fund. So yeah, like, dealing with the bank, there's a risk factor dealing with the bank. The plus is the rates are really low, right? Like, that's the plus. But I don't say it's not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed, but it's part of the game.
That's right. Okay, so I kind of cut you off just because I wanted to dig in a little bit on the financing side, because that's where a lot of people find that snag. So I'm glad we took a little dive into that. But now tell me, kind of, now we're into like the success week, right? So talk to me about through November until April. How did things change, and how did things go with the property?
Yeah, so the property, we were going to move into it, and in order to move into it, we felt like we wanted to stay there for a long period of time. And thinking harder on the area, so the neighborhood, we're a little weird. We have 14 chickens and a goose in Des Moines proper. In Des Moines, you can do that. Well, this is a neighborhood, a small community, just it's a small suburb part of Des Moines, and they only allow 2 chickens. And so it was going to really change our lives in that aspect. We're going to have to do that. They're a little bit pickier about their property. So really set back and think about, do we want to live in this place, fix it up while we're there, and then sell it in 2 years? Or do we just want to flip it? Because that is an option. And running the numbers, figuring out where the rehab funds were going to come from, I was comfortable spotting those funds based on what I was seeing in the housing market. So again, in that neighborhood, there was comparables that were fixed up houses that were almost identical to this one, that were selling for anywhere from 250 to 275. And I was pretty confident I could get the rehab done for under 40,000. And I think it came in just right at or just under. And so I set up a contractor. I had a staging crew come in, staging consult, and literally give me the report of, this is the paint color, this is the countertop color, these are the fixtures, these are the links to where to buy them from the Home Depot, Menards, wherever. And so I handed that report to the contractor and said, hey, this is what I want. Can you do it? And he could do all of it, except there's a couple pieces he subbed out. And so
What a good person to have, that
yeah,
general
it was a
contractor.
very good relationship. And then, yeah, so then we listed it. Gosh, was it March 1st? The beginning of March. So it was just after 90 days. And so one of the rules when you're flipping houses, I say lightly, 90-day period has to go by before someone buying the house can get an FHA loan. So if a flipper comes in, flips a house in 30 days, if they list it, someone that's going to get an FHA loan can't buy that house, which
Is
isn't.
that a purchase agreement, or is that a close date for the 90 days for FHA? Do you know?
I do not know that answer. That's a good question. I think it is. I don't know. I don't want to answer that.
Sure, but there is some rules, like you said, because
Yeah.
and I've heard of that on the FHA. It's like, oh, just be careful, because if they're going to do that, it's like, oh, they're just not going to be accepted, or you can only accept conventional, and that might
Yep.
limit your buyers, especially with
Yep.
the attractive 3.5% down on FHA.
Yep. So anyway, yeah. So in 91 days we listed it. It sold in 3 days for 265. And so we closed last Friday. I don't know, it was last week or something, but yeah, closed out. And then figured out closing one of those is a little difficult, because the closing company sees the buyer, and then they see one seller, but there's also the seller behind the scenes, right, who's holding the contract. So a lot more parties involved. In the future, I will definitely, and I gave them a heads up at the very beginning, but just staying on top of the settlement, the closing company, that to make sure they understand, hey, these are the parties involved. This is the involvement. You need to get payoffs here. But
Well, and a couple things that we've noted too is sometimes, and you know, this could even be on us too, like when a contract for deed is issued, because like in this case, they're dealing with a buyer, a seller, a contract for deed, and a first position mortgage on it. So like, okay, well, how do we make heads or tails of that? And for those people listening, you know, we don't want to get, you know, too in depth on it because we usually stay, you know, pretty high level. But from your case, like, okay, you're in this on a contract for deed. So how is that different than just like a traditional mortgage? And how do you see that be different?
how is that different? It to me, to as a consumer, it's exactly the same as a first mortgage.
Sure.
I didn't look at it in any other way. The fact that there was a lien on the house on the back end, or as a first lien on the house, it really doesn't have anything to do with me, because I know that I have a contract with SetYourRent to pay it off for X dollar amount. And
Sure.
as long as I get that dollar amount paid off to them, what they do with the rest of it, like it's kind of irrelevant. It needs to be done, but it's irrelevant as a consumer.
Yep.
So
And so one thing that we always say for a tip, which is something that we didn't do in this case, Darson, that's probably more of a shame on us, is when you're doing this type of an agreement with someone, when there's a level of trust, you know, a lot of things, it makes a lot of things go easier. But there is some situations where people will get taken advantage of on a contract for deed. Like for instance, what if for some reason we had taken the, you know, agreement and be like, oh, what agreement? Right. And then you all of a sudden you're like, well, you know, where's my equitable interest? And so making sure that you have, you know, the signed copy or getting something, you know, filed at the county, you know, is a big one. That's oftentimes like, okay, we just know things will work, but making sure that you follow things through so that if the title company is trying to sell this or we're trying to sell it, like, hey, there's a contract for deed here on this one, just making sure that all the proper channels get vetted. And in this case, it was like, okay, yeah, just make sure that we get the original copy, not just a signed copy and a couple other, you know, miscellaneous things. But like you said, it is just like a, okay, here were the terms, here was the interest rate, and it looks just like a mortgage where they're saying, you know, here's your amortization, here's your principal, here's your interest every month, and kind of you go from there. So you had that success, and I know you specifically are helping investors in Des Moines along with, you know, a couple other things on the real estate thing. So what's on the horizon for 2021 for Darson? Who are you trying to help?
you know, I'm struggling with that a little bit, just because it's, as a realtor, you're conditioned to think residential units, residential sales. Someone finds their dream home. That's all they as in the real estate companies teach on, is, you know, find someone to sell, find someone to buy. And because I've been an investor, I just think a little bit different, more numbers driven. I would say if someone sent me a $300,000 house versus a $500,000 house, I don't know if I'd be able to tell the difference unless it was a location difference, because I don't know what high end grade fixtures are. I don't know because I kind of now know what Viking fridges are, but I wouldn't price that into the property. But that's not my cup of tea. So, but if someone brought me a $500,000 apartment complex, I could tell you if that's overpriced or underpriced, just how the numbers lay out. And so I've really worked with a lot of investors on building their portfolio of properties that maybe cash flow, maybe don't, depending on the area, depending on what the investor's goals are. Because, and I've had them before jumping on as a realtor, I didn't realize the allure of an A class, B class property that didn't cash flow. In my mind, where I was at in my life, was a limiting belief of, why would anyone buy that? It makes no sense. Now I step back and I see and I talk with investors that, you know, they have $100,000 of extra cash sitting in their bank that, again, they don't want to put in the stock market, but they want to buy a property that they don't have to think about, that is in a good neighborhood with good tenants, that, quote unquote, not going to have too many problems with. And so helping investors try to figure that out is really what I've done a lot of in Des Moines. I'd say over 75% of the 25 transactions I've done have been with investors of that capacity.
Interesting. Yeah, and so that's probably a good tip for not only investors but home shoppers in general, where you're like, oh, here's the price point or here's the cash flow, and you look at the numbers of a 1900 house, and it meets all the numbers, you know, of like, oh, I can afford this or I can do that. But then in the investor world, when you're looking at capex or maintenance, or if you're a homeowner and you're looking at, well, how much work am I going to have to put into this 1900s home? Those are kind of the hidden things that a lot of people either sometimes don't appropriate plan for or become unexpected. We're like, well, now everything's so unique. Like, what am I doing with knob and tube wiring? Like that's like a whole new can of worms that like you just don't even expect. Whereas the person that just bought a 2020 home is like, you know what? I don't think I'm gonna have to do anything for like 10 years. And so you kind of factor that in. Yes, I'm paying more and hopefully, maybe there's some appreciation, but what a difference, 100 years can make, all the way from underground utilities to electrical to mechanical to just structural stuff. So that's a pretty good point. And as you mentioned that the A and B class, and maybe just do a quick breakdown of what do you mean by A class, B class?
Yeah, I was thinking that. So, and there's no good definition of this. I don't know how to explain it. Because I'm local in Des Moines, I can pretty much explain the areas that are A, B, C, right? And really, it kind of goes outside in. Your exterior suburbs are usually your A class, and then you get closer to the core of the city. And before you get right to the core, it's your C class, D class. Des Moines really doesn't have very much D class. It's really, there's very few bad places in Des Moines. And then you get the downtown city, and that's back up to A class properties. So the more rental properties are in a neighborhood would classify it as a C plus C type property. The more people living in a single family where they're actually living in the property, you're going to get to the A, B class style property.
Sure.
But back to your explanation though on the 1900s versus new, where it relates to a residential is really, there's so much new construction that's happening right now that when you're looking at a fixed up resale property, meaning it's built whether it's the 1900s or it's 1980s and it's been fixed up to today's standards, there's still a premium for new construction versus that. So you should not be paying for a rehabbed property that's 1,200 or 1,500 square foot, 3-bed, 2-bath in one neighborhood. The next neighborhood, there's a new construction going. Like, that's not the same property, even though it fits all the same criteria. It fits the same bath, it fits the same, everything is the same except the year built. You're still going to pay less for that resale property. So
Sure.
Things to think about when you're shopping around for a home, and where to compare those two types of houses.
And that's why it's good talking with an agent who can explain those things, because you could walk into the same house and it might look the same, might look identical. We're like, oh, well, that sewer line was put in 1950. This sewer line was put in 2020. Like, if the average life of a sewer line is 50 years, like, okay, well, you may have a $5,000 expense on something, whereas the other one's like, okay, you're never going to have it. So that's why having an agent is super helpful. So if you had to describe, Darson, the type of people that you help, who would those people be?
I'd say people that are two facets. A residential individual that is looking to house hack, buy duplex, 3-plex, 4-plex to live in. Like I've done
specifically, sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah.
Specifically in an area or anywhere, just because there are listeners across.
Yeah, I'd say in Iowa, in Des Moines, within like a 60-mile radius of Des Moines.
Okay.
So there's, in Iowa, you have Des Moines, the most populated, and then you have a couple, Cedar Rapids, Waterloo, Sioux City, Council Bluffs, Omaha. I stay kind of in the state capital, in the core. So yeah.
Okay, so that's bucket number one. Okay.
Yep. And then bucket number 2 would be an investor that is looking for a rundown property ready to flip or turn it into a rental. I've got a pretty good eye on what's coming on the market, all of the wholesalers, and I'm an agent that will work with wholesalers and figure out that happy medium of getting a buyer, connecting them.
And if somebody wanted to connect with you, Darson, what's the best way?
I'd say email, text. Find me on Facebook. So Darson Grantham, pretty unique name. If you I say just Google it, you'll find, the best place to reach out. So
yes, so I'm going to spell it out. So Darson's pretty easy, Darson, but Grantham, Grantham, is a little bit of a unique last name that if you're able to find that, I probably won't put your cell phone number in the show notes, but I'll put your email on there. And then we'll just go back on which one you want to have in there, Darson.
Yeah, that's fine.
and I suppose you could just tell people if you want, which one do you want on there?
Email?
Yeah.
Yeah, you could, dgrantham@kw.com.
Wonderful. That's how people can get a hold of you. Well,
Yep.
Darson, thank you for sharing your experience on both the investor, the buyer, the agent, the contract for deed. I'm happy that everything worked out for you, and kind of sharing your story on how people can basically level up their life through real estate, whether you're living in it, whether you're doing it as an investment property. So I appreciate all that. And if anyone's looking for a home or investment property in that area, would strongly recommend reaching out to Darson.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Take care.
Yep. Bye.